It can be all too easy for us as empty nest mums or after a divorce, the loss of a loved one, to find ourselves asking if God still has a purpose for us. So if you ever felt that your most significant contributions might be behind you, or wondered if, as you get older, God can still use you in meaningful ways, I think this story is really going to speak to you. Today we're diving into the story of Deborah and Jael, whose story you can find in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5. These women were established in their communities, probably had decades of life experience between them, but God called them to step into roles that would change the course of Israel's history. What I love so much about this story is that God spoke directly to them, equipped them for everything He called them to do, and they accomplished His purposes because they obeyed and they had courage. So, if you've been waiting for someone to invite you to step up and use your gifts, or been hesitating because no one's given you permission, or perhaps you're just wondering if it's too late to start something new, this message is for you. Because it's never too late for God to write a new chapter in your story. Judges 4 begins with the Israelites doing what's evil in the sight of God, and as a direct result of this, God sells them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. The commander of his armies was called Sisera, and we're told that he had an impressive and pretty intimidating army and 900 chariots of iron, and that for 20 years this king oppressed the people of Israel. Finally, they called out to God for help. And it's at this point that Deborah steps onto the stage. You may recall from Hannah's story, which we explored in episode 5, that her son Samuel came at a time when the people were fed up with judges and wanted a king. And of course, he anointed both King Saul and King David. Now, Deborah is the 4th judge named in the book of Judges and the only woman among them. And a judge's role was very different from that of a king because each judge was chosen by God. It wasn't an inherited role. And they brought spiritual wisdom and led in times of crisis. And God used the judges to guide His people and deliver them from oppression. They'd also deal with disputes, giving the people answers and resolving them in line with the law. Now, this story took place thousands of years ago, so I don't know about you, I find it quite remarkable that nobody seems to have questioned Deborah's authority. The text doesn't mention any resistance to her leadership just because she was a woman. She simply took her place as the judge God had appointed. And as we'll see later, the leader of the Israelite armies, Barak, was not only happy to submit to her, but he depended on her for victory. So let's look at the historical context for this story, which happened about 150 to 200 years after the Israelites have entered the Promised Land. And once Joshua's died, the Israelites did not fully drive out the people of the land as God had commanded them. So in this way, for 20 years, they disobeyed God and were oppressed by the king of Canaan. So this story about this battle that's coming up is about them, the Israelite people, reclaiming what God has already promised, what they'd already taken but had lost. If you've ever read through the Old Testament, one pattern you'll definitely see is God's people messing up again and again. Then God sends an enemy against them, they cry out to God, and God rescues them. This happens again and again, and it's the exact context for this story. We're told that Deborah, a prophetess, was judging Israel and that she used to sit under the palm between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and that the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. And it's there that God speaks to her, and she summons Barak to come to her. And she doesn't beat about the bush when she asks him, "Hasn't God already told you to go down and defeat this army of 10,000 men?" So from her words, it seems as if maybe God has already spoken to Barak, but Barak has hesitated or held back, maybe doubted even. And as a military leader and a man, we can perhaps understand the reasons why, because the Canaanites under Sisera were a formidable force. They had 900 iron chariots, and of course chariots could move swiftly and effectively against foot soldiers, which gave them a huge tactical advantage. And an experienced military leader would have known that there was no way they could win against that army, so victory must have seemed in the natural impossible. Yet Deborah speaks to Barak. "Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor. taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give them into your hand. And this is how God reveals the winning strategy to the Israelite army faced with overwhelming odds. He will draw them out, and he will give the victory. And once she's shared this kind of prophetic word with him, Barak replies, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And isn't that strangely reminiscent of that phrase we heard from Ruth, where she says, "Where you will go, I will go"? It's kind of the same poetic quality, but he doesn't display Ruth's courage. And it's quite interesting. It's quite similar to when Moses says to God, "I just can't do this on my own. I'm not a good public speaker." And God says, "Okay, Aaron can go with you." And so Aaron, his brother, accompanies him in all the visits where he goes to Pharaoh to speak. And of course, it might seem a bit strange to us, but in those days it was quite usual for the spiritual or the wise leader to not only be present at battles, but to actually affect their outcome. Think about that story in Exodus when the Israelites were attacked by the Amalekites, and God commanded Moses to stand on top of a hill while his brother Aaron led the army into battle. As long as Moses' hands were raised, Israel was winning. When his arms were lowered, they were losing. And so the presence of Moses, the spiritual leader, changed the outcome of the battle. And yet there's still something in the way that Barak replies that does not fully seem to express his trust in God. You feel he's hesitating? Yet, of course, even despite this hesitation, if we scroll forward a few pages in our Bible to Hebrews 11, we'll see that Barak is named in the Hebrews 11 Hall of Fame. I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because we can also have a calling on our lives, we can win victories, feel as if we've taken 7 steps forward, but then we make a mistake, lose our courage, or something happens and we take 5 steps back. And we can do this even after seasons where we've seen God at work in our lives, and we can then find ourselves kind of on that back foot. And it's so easy when that happens, when we make a mistake, when we trip, when we have a setback, when life just throws us too much stuff, we can be tempted to write ourselves off. We can just focus on the fact that we've messed up, that we've failed. But here, what I see is God is giving Barak another chance. It's almost as if God is saying, it's time to take back the land that's been taken from you. Maybe that's something God is saying to you today. Perhaps there's something that's been taken from you by the enemy that you just know in your knower that God has promised you. Perhaps it's time to just start listening in for that still small voice of God so that you're ready to hear and act when he tells you that it's time. Anyhow, let's get back to our story. So Deborah replies to Barak, "I will go with you, but the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then she arose and went with him to Kadesh, and Barak called up 10,000 men from the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and Deborah stayed with him. So Deborah tells Barak that God will not give the glory to him, but that Sisera will fall at the hands of a woman. This is such a powerful moment. Think about every movie you've ever seen from that kind of time. The movie 300 with King Leonidas, Gladiator, Spartacus. They all will feature strong and powerful men. In a society where we fought so hard for equal rights, we can fail to see just how surprising Deborah's words to Barak were. The idea that anybody could bring this commander of the armies, Sisera, down was pretty incredible, but the idea of it being a woman would have seemed impossible. So it seems quite likely that whispers of Deborah's words would have spread like wildfire, not only among the army, but also throughout the area. The idea of a woman taking down Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, was the complete opposite of everyone's expectations. Now, when Sisera heard that Barak and his men had gone up to Mount Tabor, He called up his armies and his 900 iron chariots. And again, we see Deborah intervening and shaping this story and sense God's timing in it all as she urges Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you?" Don't miss how powerful these words are. She's saying, does not the Lord go out before you? Because he's the one who's really leading the charge in this battle. And even though Barak is the head figure, he's actually just following behind God. And I think her words are so encouraging because she's reminding Barak that even when the odds look overwhelming, if God promises victory, he is the one who's in control and he's the one who's leading the charge. For an army facing seemingly impossible odds, her words must have stirred courage. Because, of course, the Israelites knew their history. They knew that God had done the impossible before. And so they knew that God could do it again for them. When God spoke, the victory had already been won in the supernatural, spiritual realm. Barak just had to go and take hold of that victory in the natural world. And as he stepped out in obedience to God, just as God had done before, he used the smaller, weaker army to defeat the stronger one. And we, of course, see this pattern repeated throughout Scripture in the story of Gideon, who takes 300 men up against 135,000, or the young shepherd boy David, who defeated Goliath. Each faced overwhelming odds, but when God leads and promises victory, they stepped into that promise and took hold of it and saw everything he promised fulfilled. Do you remember earlier that God had laid out the strategy to beat the enemy? In fact, he said, "I will draw out Sisera to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariot and his troops." He knew what would happen, and we learn later from Deborah and Barak's song in Judges 5 that when they marched it was raining, and that the river Kishon became a torrent which, we're told, swept away Sisera's army. Of course, we can't be certain, but it also seems likely that the rain might have caused the chariots to lose their effectiveness, since the battleground was right next to a river. Perhaps they even got bogged down, and perhaps that's why we see that Sisera had to flee on foot. Now, the Bible tells us that the Lord routed Sisera. The original Hebrew word for routed means to scatter or to cause to flee, and it kind of conveys the idea of dispersing or driving an enemy into confusion, causing them to flee in panic or chaos. It can also mean to break up or to crush, implying a sense of total defeat or destruction, where the enemy is overwhelmed to the point of being broken apart. And so Sisera's armies flee, and Barak and the Israelites pursue them until not a single man is left. So this was a decisive victory where the enemy was completely crushed. And in the chaos that followed, Sisera fled with his tail between his legs, heading to what he thought was neutral territory, the tent of Heber the Kenite, because Heber the Kenite had made peace with King Jabin of Canaan. So it was reasonable for Sisera to assume that this was a safe place, much as Switzerland was neutral during the Second World War, or churches have often been places of sanctuary. And this is where a second woman enters the picture, Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. When Sisera arrives at her tent, as dictated by the laws of hospitality, Jael goes out to meet him and saying, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." Thirsty after the battle, he asks for some water, and Jael gives him milk to drink, then covers him with a rug. And Sisera asks Jael to deny that he's present should anyone come looking for him, and promptly falls fast asleep from exhaustion. And it's here that the narrative changes from hospitable wife to warrior woman. Now, we don't know exactly when Jael decided to kill Sisera. We don't know at which point it became clear to her that she must kill him. Perhaps it was before he arrived at her tent, perhaps it was after. Perhaps she'd even heard of Deborah's prophecy that a woman would be his downfall. Or perhaps it was only as he lay sleeping that God revealed his plan to her. We just don't know. What we do know is that Deborah prophesied that a woman would kill this man, and that Jael was the fulfillment of that prophecy. And later in Deborah and Barak's song in Judges 5, we learn that Sisera asked for water and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank. He fell. He lay still. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. It sure is one heck of a victory song. Now, Jael took a huge risk because, Sisera, if he'd awoken, there's no doubt that as an experienced military man and leader, he would have very likely overwhelmed Jael and killed her in a matter of seconds. The manner of his death may seem brutal to us today, but Jael worked with what she had to hand. A hammer and a tent peg were her only weapons. It's hard, isn't it, to imagine what ran through Jael's mind as she picked up the hammer and the peg, as she crept quietly across the tent floor, stood poised above the sleeping man, getting ready to strike one single deadly blow. Just for context, archaeological findings suggest that the tent peg she held was probably 6 to 12 inches, that's 15 to 30 centimetres long, and about 1 to 2 inches, that's 2.5 to 5 centimetres wide, and was probably made from wood or metal. And so, as we learned from Deborah and Barak's song, she struck Sisera, crushed his head, shattered and pierced his temple. Of course, we can't fully understand Jael's motivation or when she decided that she would kill Sisera, but what we can see in this story is God's sovereignty. He takes this neutral home, this neutral woman, this neutral family, and uses them for good. And this is a principle that we see both in the Bible and today, that God can use non-believers to bless and provide for believers. But am I the only one wondering what on earth her husband said when he got home? Because their family was supposed to be friends with the Canaanites, and he comes home to find Sisera dead in his tent and blood all over the floor. Man, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall when that happened? But of course, the first person who came into her tent wasn't her husband. At least that's not told in this story, but it's Barak, the leader of the Israelites, who comes by. And in just the same way as she had welcomed Sisera, she goes out to meet him and invites him into the tent. But of course, the outcome is totally different. Wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall at that moment, to see Barak's face when he finds his enemy, Sisera, laid dead on the floor inside, just as Deborah had said, by the hand of a woman? And so the Israelites triumphed over their enemy and oppressor of 20 years, and they eventually killed Jabin, king of the Canaanites. And after this battle, there's peace for 40 years. As women, it can seem pretty hard to contemplate that such a violent act was the will and purpose of God. Now, I don't know about you, when I read about the Proverbs 31 woman, I am not thinking about leading an army into battle. I'm not thinking about driving a tent peg through someone's head. And yet both Jael and Deborah were women called by God for those specific purposes. Yet I guess we only have to look back to the stories of Joan of Arc, who God used to bring about a military victory, Rosa Parks, who was a key figure in the American civil rights movement, or even Corrie ten Boom, who defied the Nazis to see that God is still using women to lead and bring about his purposes today. You know, there's that list of things that you're supposed to do to be a godly woman in Proverbs 31. You know, the get up early, feed your household. You know the list. And it's almost as if this amazing chapter of the Bible is reduced to a checklist of things that we need to do. But what if, instead, we looked at the heart of the Proverbs 31 and see what it was that motivated her? If we learn anything from this story, we learn that women that God calls do not fit into any neat mould. God calls and anoints whoever he chooses to for whatever is needed. Deborah was called to lead and guide a nation. Jael was called to be this warrior woman. Each played very different parts, but each played the exact part that God had called them to perfectly. And what I love about this story is that we see God calling women to leadership, God using women to be his instruments. God calls women to his purposes, and when he does, they don't need anybody to give them approval. He speaks directly to these women, tells them what he wants them to do, and gives them everything they need to accomplish it. And I think that's exactly what he does today. I think so often as women, we wait till somebody invites us into leadership. And I'll be honest with you, in many of today's churches, that may never happen. But that doesn't mean that God hasn't put a call on your life. Whatever it is you feel in your heart, when you know that God's speaking to you, you don't need anybody's yes. You just need God's yes. I want to interject and just tell you a short story about myself and my friend called Chris. At church one day I was going to say moaning, but obviously as Christians we don't moan, ha ha. But we were discussing in a lively fashion about the lack of women's events in our church. We'd both seen and felt that there was a need, and suddenly I just looked up at Chris and I said, "Chris, I think God's asking us to do this." Now, at this point, I was in my early 60s, when I might have thought that the days of starting new ministries were behind me, but looking back, I can see that God obviously had other plans. And so we went to the leadership and asked, can we run a women's breakfast event? And they said yes. And from then on, we ran a number of women's breakfast events where women really met with God in a powerful way. All because we were faithful to that small whisper. Just think about it for a moment, especially for those in our 50s or 60s and beyond. We've spent decades building wisdom, gaining experience, and gaining spiritual maturity. Why would God set all of that aside? It just doesn't make sense. I honestly believe that instead of seeing our age as a limitation, we should recognize it as the very qualification God is looking for in this season. My friend Chris and I didn't wait for an invitation. We heard God's call and stepped forward. And sometimes that's all it takes. Just recognizing the need and being willing to say yes to God's whisper to your heart. Barak needed someone to confirm God's word, but Deborah already had God's yes, and she stepped right into it. And so did Jael. I love this story. I've always loved it since I first heard about a woman driving a tent peg through the enemy's head, because it shows us that God raises up unlikely heroes and leads us on unprecedented paths. So, friend, if you're in a season where you're wondering if your most significant contributions are behind you, please hear me today. God's not finished with you, not even close. If you're feeling that longing for purpose, that sense that there must be something more, pay attention to the quiet whispers in your heart. They may very well be the Holy Spirit stirring something new in you. Your decades of life experience, the wisdom you've gained through your trials, victories, and even the scars you carry. These aren't disqualifications. They're the very things God wants to use. Perhaps you've been waiting for your pastor, church leader, family, or your community to recognize your gifts and invite you to use them. But what if, like Deborah, like Jael, God is speaking directly to you? What if he's already said yes to that dream in your heart? So listen to what he's put on your heart. Take small steps of faith and see what God might do with your simple life if you're faithful to follow wherever he leads. Thanks so much for spending this time with me today. If something from this episode has touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it with a friend who might need to hear that God can use them and has a purpose for them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review if you found it helpful. You can connect with me on Facebook at Jennifer Carter Writer, or head over to Amazon where you can find my devotionals. The book based on this podcast series is Invisible Women of the Bible, and it's in the final stages of the editing. So by the time you listen to this, maybe it's already live on Amazon. And this book explores the often untold stories of women of the Bible and explores how they found hope, healing, and purpose in the middle of their difficult seasons. So until next time, remember, God doesn't need anyone's permission to call you. You can lead without permission if he's already said yes. And when you do, he'll give you everything you need to do what he asks you to do. So be faithful to that small whisper and wait and see what God will do, because he hasn't finished writing your story yet.